We are again coming back to a very interesting topic of the historical processes or the way how the destinies of nations or people are going to get what I should say determined in that sense. So in this sense, if we take recourse to the continuation of this book, there have been studies where Iqbal has not only just enumerated or he has touched upon thinkers like Ibn Maskuya, Ibn Khaldun, Spengler, mainly these three, and maybe he has tried to contrast, or he has tried to not contrast, he has tried to relate them, how Quran sees the way the nations see the Quranic way of understanding history in that sense. Apart from the Anfusi and the Afaq reference which are there in the book, so here Iqbal also tries to say that there is a third source of humans history or a language. In the language of the Quran, the days of the God is the third source of human knowledge according to Quran. So you can say primarily this is the way how destinies of nations. And in this subject, there's a larger subject of which is very much oft quoted, oft analyzed subject right across, which not only deals with the destinies of individuals, but in nations, the rise and fall of nations, the rise and fall of civilizations. What are the causative factors? So is it a general evolutionary course where a nation will come, it will rise, then it will decay, or there are some intrinsic merits to it, or intrinsic reasons according to which things move, nations move. So is there something here also, this question of predestination or predetermination in that sense? So are the historical courses predetermined, or are they predeterministic in that sense? So here maybe the Quranic view is more that the rise and fall of not only individuals but also nations is their own moral choice in that sense. If certain attributes are to be found, they will naturally lead to how individuals or nations will arise. So those attributes are, according to Quran, or according to how the Iqbal has tried to quote Quran, in the sense in the moral equivalents of how we define things in that sense. But since history as a study, as an independent objective study, it has not always been like that, particularly in the Muslim historiography, how people have studied history, or they have reported, or they have constructed past, which is always contested, as it has always been the how we report or how we construct or reconstruct past from individual reports, individual historians, or interpretations of history, which is always contested in that sense. So what is the criteria by which we can come to some objective view of history? So in the Muslim historiography, there have been people like Ibn Tabri, Masudi, Ibn Maskuya, and maybe Ibn Khaldun is one of the towering figures, apart from many people who have they have their own have arrived at their own criterion of how we can report or how we can interpret historical events in that sense. So the role of Ibn Khaldun has been maybe defining, which we'll discuss how he has been, his way of looking at things has defined, has being considered very much canonical. Not canonical, it's influential or in that sense. So before we come to Ibn Khaldun, or before we talk of Ibn Maskuya in that sense, or we can also relate these very historical, how we can, what are the primary causes by which we can see whether a nations rise or fall. So are the causes political, economic, sociological, apart from the way these things have been here. So in the modern historiography, the Marxist way of looking at history is pinning only on the economic factors in that sense, or culture, or in the Ibn Khaldunian sense, the cultural factors, which uses the term asbiya in that sense. So what are the, or if so different studies have different ways of looking at things. So even whether there is centrality can be given to a one particular cause. So in the postmodernistic interpretation of history, there is no center. So you cannot have one primary cause, or whether there is cause at all in that sense, or whether objective history, the reconstruction of objectivity history is itself not possible in that sense. So it borders from on the history borders on mythos and logos part of it. So these are different viewpoints, or the decline of West, the way Spengler has, which Iqbal has also quoted here, the inevitability of things coming, reaching blossoming, and then decaying as a normal process in that sense. So there is an eternal predeterminism associated with rise and fall of things in that sense, which is not unique, which is not unique to specific cultures or civilizations or nations in that sense. So this is the broad, what I should say, sketch around which we are going to frame this very lecture in that sense. So and we just interspersing with various lines or of this text in that sense. So here, in that sense, so there are, for example, so there are very, if we quote Quranic verses, which in consonance with this book. So what Quran says. So we had created people who would guide us others with in accordance with their with justly. Already before your time, precedents have been made. Traverse the earth then and see what hath been the end of those who falsify the signs of God. So you go to earth. So in the Quranic way of looking at things, so there have been people or nations who have disobeyed the edicts of God or divine commandments, and some. So this is the thing. They have been punished. They have been bestowed with gifts, but if they did not, they just strayed from that path, and in that process they were destroyed or vanquished in that sense. So here, every nation hath its fixed path, and this is what. So there is sort of so you can say a predestination, or in the Quranic way of it's tilka tadawil. So we just change this power centers among nations, among people. It goes from one people to another people or nations. The center of power doesn't remain. God just consciously changes these centers of powers or centers of excellences from nations to nations in that sense, which can be predictably understandable, the way you can say Ottomans came, the rise of British Empire, the rise of America, now rise of China. You can or rise of this. So you can see these are natural processes. But the important point is rather than trying to see why, there is also an individual choice in that sense. Why should it move from one point to another? So what is the point in that sense? So here there are specific reasons which, as historians or Muslim these historians, have tried to pin down or attempted to, particularly Ibn Khaldun. So starting with the way this book Ibn Maskuya, so we'll just start with the way Ibn Maskuya, because Ibn Maskuya has been previously also said, the way Ibn Maskuya has been as such inspiring for figures apart from Iqbal, not only sociologists and historians, but also biologists also in that sense. So he has used what I should say, there is something called he has used the something called infial. He has used a word in that sense. So I don't have this thing. So the biological way of how an organism evolves, it grows, it has a youth, and then somehow it sensates and it ages in that sense. So human societies can also have that biological, the way biologists would like to see in that sense. So Ibn Maskuya wrote 6 volumes. So he was considered as the first, not only a stylist and a social thinker. He just had an organismistic view of society in his mind when he says that every body is an organ of society, similar to a body that is constituted of different organisms. So intellection, which is taqul, and sensation, means hiss, are both common to potentiality. So in that sense, Shibli Nomani talks that his ideas have been similar to that of Darwinian in the evolutionary sense. The only thing is, in the Darwinian evolution sense, evolution is not theistic in that sense. So here we should say that the important thing in the historiography is how they chronologically recorded events is there is a very strong thing, something called hadith literature, how the individual reports, or which are also called khabre ahad in the terminology, that how to verify a given account, which may be due to an individual report but can be verified from multiple accounts in that sense. How we can verify the veracity of an individual report? So there is a whole study of ilm al-rijal or ilm al-hadith to it. The whole how can what are the criteria of verifying an individual report in that sense. So there's a whole science to it which early Muslims have developed in that sense. So you can say that is the foundation of how later people developed this subject of historiography, or in that sense. But historiography, if we will try to see in the Muslim sense, that so you have to study it that way. So in that context, you can say Ibn Maskuya was one of the historians in the rational sense of the word. In that sense, he wrote those historical volumes, but he tried to make rationality. He tried to be more objective in that sense. So before this thing, so if we want to see Ibn Khaldun, coming of Ibn Khaldun, because Ibn Khaldun, which Iqbal also has discussed time and again, but the point Iqbal wants to mention is that the Ibn Khaldun's primary source of inspiration has been how Quran wants to see fundamentally things in that sense. So his inspiration may be from Quran, according to how Iqbal wants to see Ibn Khaldun, or he wants to place Ibn Khaldun in that sense. But if you want to see Ibn Khaldun on his own, how he tried to see, so Ibn Khaldun can be better studied, seen in the sense that so. So if I quote Ibn Khaldun defines history is as defined with Khaldun is defined. It is a concern with the nature and causes of the actual existence, actual causes of those historical things existence. For example, in the Aristotelian sense, the end of theoretical knowledge is truth. The end of practical knowledge is good action, which is in political science. So, end of theoretical knowledge is not uh, that we call political science. Its end is not theoretical knowledge, but practical action. Similarly, we call medicine as a science that its end is healing. So, the way Muslim early these thinkers from maybe Imam Ghazali to Imam Tusi, so a lot of this thing how to classify science, the whole hierarchy of sciences, which I discussed in the previous lectures also, which is superior science, which is inferior science, or how one science is related to another science, how metaphysics is related to logic, how logic is related to epistemology, and how we can characterize how mathematics, physics, philosophy. So you can see how we can classify these science schemes. So there also comes something called useful sciences, or sciences which are meant for truth, and sciences which are meant to be practically good in that sense. So in that science, which Ibn Khaldun calls science of culture, so we have three elements which are artistic, which are productive, or which may be theoretical or practical. So the immediate science of culture, which Ibn Khaldun is calling, is the rectification of historical reports. So this is the primary definition of Ibn Khaldun. So ultimate end of the science of culture is perfection in the art of history. So this is the way we will try to understand Ibn Khaldun in that sense. So it's the rectification of historical reports. What are the historical reports? Which I said, the way his Hadith literature has been carefully constructed. How we can verify a single historical report in that sense, and how we can verify it from multiple ways, multiple chains, which is known in literature isnadi literature. How we can verify the different chains of those isnads, and coming from a given source or multiple sources, and how we can arrive at a given judgment in that sense. So there's a whole classification of ilm al-rijal. So here we can understand, under this consideration, we can understand the position of Imam Ibn Khaldun. He was in the post-Malikian era in that sense, but the thing is that he was in the, for example, Ibn Khaldun elaborated on the particular traditions, including that of Medina, could be as expressions underlying universal order of things, an order that could be ascertained by observation and valid reasoning. So, what is the way to arrive those that sort of knowledge which has not been uncorruptible, or which is pure in that sense? So in that sense, there have been dialectical theologians, which are also called mutakallims, or maybe Ibn Khaldun tries to maybe reformulate he is in the tradition of Imam Razi. In the considered a dialectical theology to be merely as a useful weapon in combating heresies and preserving faith of Muslims against the encroachment of philosophical doubts. So maybe Ibn Khaldun is also trying to say, for example, the Maliki tradition, which was more a sort of provincial, coming closer to Medina way of things, a more provincial way of seeing things, the purity of original things. The early Muslims, that was the standard torch bearer of just accepting or rejecting things. But with the coming of this Mu'tazilite school, which was emphasizing on rational discourses, which was maybe influenced by Greek thought also. So maybe Ibn Khaldun was trying to maneuver in these different positions in that sense. So maybe you can say he was more in also closer to Farabi, Ibn Sina, and Ibn Rushd in that sense. So his book, famous book, the Ibar, which he is, so it's a record of origin of events, which is of Persians, Arabs, Berbers, and their contemporaries who were in the positions of great power in that sense. So, so Ibn Khaldun's main objective was not merely to relate history, but to pass beyond history and to learn from it, not merely to pass through it. So Ibn Khaldun's use of Ibra becomes synonymous with reasoning, nazar, or understanding, faham in that sense. So here are a set of questions which Ibn Khaldun tried to fundamentally address in that sense. So this is I have taken from Ibn Khaldun historian Mohsin Mahdi, who says what are the questions which Ibn Khaldun tried to address. One is how to interpret general meaning of revelation yet preserve its verbal integrity. How to explore new fields of knowledge yet preserve already existing knowledge. How to express results of research without jeopardizing social order. How to connect with other unknowns, leading to wrong conclusions and wise actions. So Ibn Khaldun had to work under the censorship of religious orthodoxy, it said. So you can see under this thing he had put these 3-4 questions in order to understand how to see history or historical these questions in that sense. What was the tight leash or boundary and in that sense. So in that sense, maybe Ibn Khaldun also used a different terminology. He uses the internal causes and the external causes, which I'll come to by what he means by that. So he, by blurring the distinction between human beings, the dialecticians have blurred the distinction between the positive sciences based on law and philosophical sciences based on demonstrative reasoning. Maybe he might be operating in an era where, because he was operating in an era where the post these Ash'arite, Mu'tazilites, these debates have been there. How the edification of these sciences later, the ilm al-tafsir, ilm al-hadith, the fiqh, and so how he could maneuver and see a certain position in that sense, jurisprudence, fiqh. So in that sense. So the way I said, the way politics is a science which is aimed at some practical end in that sense. In the same sense, so Ibn Khaldun's attempt to introduce the distinction between dialectical theology and mysticism and between both philosophy was ostensibly aimed to define the proper objective of positive sciences and redirecting them to a particular end. So dialectical theologians and mystics are handled with kindness and care with Ibn Khaldun. So now the thing is that so which I said that history as a subject of profession which started in Islam with the search for and the collection of transmission of individual reports, akhbar ahad, about specific events, and the subjects of ilm al-rijal or jarh wal ta'dil have been just towards the trying to see that isnadi tradition in that sense. So maybe in that sense the way apart from before Ibn Khaldun there has been Tabari, there has been Masudi, and there has been Ibn Ishaq. For example, Tabari grew in a controversy between traditional theological schools and students of newly translated Hellenic rational sciences known as Mu'tazilites. As a historian, he often stressed the belief that history is not a rational discipline and that humans don't play a significant role in it. So what's the position of Tabari is more that history is not a rational discipline. So what's the basic important fact he stressed on the what I should say, he solved the problem by taking recourse to profit and the price predecessors. That was the given rod in that sense. But he also resorted to maybe these New Testaments, Jewish and Christian historians, and Persian chronicles in that sense. So as compared to, for example, Ibn Maskuya, who was more a sort of rational and objective in that sense. He in his how he documented historical facts, or Ibn Masudi, he was more philosophically oriented, or Ibn Athar, he was in that sense. So here is an important, for example, sentence of Iqbal. For example, Iqbal says, the Quranic appeal to experience, the necessity to explain the exact sayings of Prophet, and desire to furnish permanent sources of inspiration to posterity. All these forces contributed to produce such men as Ibn Ishaq, Tabari, and Masudi. But history as an art of firing the reader's imagination is only a stage in the development of history as a genuine science. So this is the way early Muslims, these attempts of historiography has been seen in that sense, trying to reach to something. For example, the Iqbal quoting Quranic verse, "O believers, if a man comes to you with a report, clear it at once." So the coming of a report or a judgment, and the character of that judgment, the report is dependent upon the character of judgment of the individual person's character. So the veracity of that report, that indictment, to clarify it, it's a sort of a need in that sense, or a duty in that sense, which may be important thing how civilizationally things have gone in that direction, in that sense. So the attempt of dialectical theology to defend traditional historiography was a part of wider attempt to defend traditional Islam itself. It's Imam Razi. So for example, Masudi shifted emphasis from political chronology to world cultural history. Ibn Miskawiyah elaborated on the rational use of secular history for ethical and political purposes. The history of Tabari and Ibn Athar, which conceived history as primarily the compilation of factual information and not the tradition of Masudi and Ibn Biruni, which initiated philosophical or theoretical investigation in Islamic historiography. So Ibn Khaldun differentiates the method of critical inquiry nazar from merely copying nakal. This in turn leads Ibn Khaldun to distinction between two attitudes of mind among students of history. So he, for example, Ibn Khaldun, the critical nakid attitude which penetrates into regions of one is he is differentiating, one is the nature and the causes of the history. The other is the report itself. So Ibn Khaldun not only talks about the nature and the causes of history, which he separately uses, the internal and the external causes, but also he even talks of how those individual reports are about those individual reports. So people normally before may be concentrated on the reports only, what were the nature of the individual, whether the report is true or not in that sense. But Ibn Khaldun also tried to see the veracity of how it has been the report, the lens by which we can interpret the data, theory itself in that sense. So Ibar, his book, is concerned with both external and internal aspects of history, the distinction being between mere copying and critical enquiry is repeated. So the words like Mughaliya, the fanciful accounts, Awham. So in that sense, you can say so this is what I have said. He tries to shift the argument from the criticism of authority, of transmission of reports, to consideration of content of reports themselves. So this is a very important thing. So what are the factors which determine the character of a historian in that sense? So there may be partisanship, there may be overconfidence in resources, there may be failure to understand the intention of reports, there may be unfounded credulous, failure to understand events in their proper context, and interest in gaining favor with power or influential. And maybe Ibn Khaldun also distinguishes between the popular literature or wisdom literature, popular sayings, from the actual history. So he doesn't want to confuse the two. He says that's not the history in that sense. So if you say, since Ibn Khaldun was also influenced by logic, the Greek sciences, so the Aristotle, the syllogistic reasoning, which, or maybe in jurisprudence, so where we try to ultimately just pin down a particular argument by a certain sort of reasoning or syllogistic reasoning in that sense. So which according to Aristotle, whose purpose is to silence a contentious opponent. A dialectical argument can start with opinions or promises used as opinions in that sense. So these may be held by all, few, or by wise or by experts in the fields. So historical report deals with events that manifest essential modes of culture as it is not as it ought to be. So according to Ibn Khaldun, the new science will have to be investigate the nature and causes of culture as it is and not as it ought to be. So things as they are, not what they ought to be. Those cultural prejudices or the prejudices which unconsciously also people who report things or people, historians who interpret things, those prejudices which come into being, whether we report things or whether we interpret those reports in terms of historical documents. So Ibn Khaldun's contribution can be seen also trying to investigate those very questions. Modulo the way I have used how Mohsin what are the boundaries of that Mohsin Mahdi, those four the start, where I try to see what are the reasons uh, reasons, what are the boundaries around which those questions are addressed, how to interpret general meaning of revelation yet preserve its verbal integrity, how to explore new fields of knowledge yet preserve already existing knowledge, so on and so forth, in that sense. So now here comes so we are going to connect it with Iqbal's thing also in that sense. So here maybe this is the way. So Iqbal is trying to say that what he is not trying to deny the contribution of Iqbal, but Ibn Khaldun, but he is trying to say how how Ibn Khaldun inspiration was maybe Quran consciously or unconsciously in that sense. Yes. So, for example, however, the interest of Quran in history, regarded as a source of human knowledge, extends farther than mere indication of historical generalization. It has given us one of the most fundamental principles of historical criticism. Means how we can judge or accept a given report or not in that sense. So here, for example, Iqbal says his conception is of important because of the implication that history, as a continuous movement in time, is genuinely creative movement, not a movement whose path is already determined. So maybe Iqbal is more, he is not primarily interested in the those whether the dialectical forces of history are predetermined in that sense, in the Spenglerian sense, or in that in the sense of those eternal recurrence, things coming, reaching. So, but he wants to have some human agency to it, individual choice also to it in that sense. So, there he wants to see also Ibn Khaldun's study also in some sense, in that sense. For example, Ibn Khaldun maybe he rejects these two alternate theories of culture, which is linear theory and cyclical theory, both of which asserted that there is one culture or that all human history is one interrelated whole. So, for example, man's desire for revenge leads him to contrary to reason, and his desire for riches leads him to self-destruction. So, maybe Iqbal, this, if you go to Ibn Khaldun's study, he has given those. He has mostly used the term asbiya, how a society transforms from an agrarian, Roman, tribal, nomadic thing where life is rugged, rigid, and how leader he has used the word asbiya, and which we can also say from the way Quran says that we have organized mankind in tribes and this thing for recognition only. So how and but Ibn Khaldun takes how the society evolves from the nomadic thing, then it goes to settled thing, but that civilization leads to corruption also, and how it in the first, second, third generation it leads to decay in that sense. How the settled life leads to corruption and other things also in that sense. So he believed that physical, geographical, biological, and social factors are responsible for this thing. Now the question is that it's also engenders larger questions, like for example, For example, if you see in the previous passage also, Iqbal is also trying to say that eternal recurrence is not eternal creation, it's eternal repetition. So Iqbal also previously critiquing Nietzsche, his idea of eternal recurrence in that sense. So, so, so if that way, but that's a particular notion of time. But if you want to also see it in terms of eternal recurrence masquerading uh, as something new, it's eternal repetition. But Ibn Khaldun is more talking about eternal renewal as compared to eternal recurrence in that sense. So things may come good, they may down, but again there's a that thing you can come back in the renewed form with the renewed vigor in that sense. So it's not recurrence, which may be boring for Iqbal. But here, if we try to study the modern studies like that, so if I just so why, for example, nations fail. This is a famous book, Why Nations Fail, in which the authors have tried to pin down the causes, whether especially Spanish, the different examples are taken from different nations, why nations failed in that sense. But so according to those authors, they are saying that there are exploitative factors in the institutions which are being manipulated or taken by those exploitative groups which are responsible. So there is a certain monopolized elite which does not allow the benefits to accrue to the general population in that sense, and it leads to sort of decay or in that sense, which may, for example, the current political and economic balance may alter, and there may be various changes and which alter the decay of nations in that sense. But those studies don't primarily talk about the moral causes. Why do individuals or nations behave in a particular way? So is economic interest the the economic how we can balance out things, but why should they don't uh, they don't penetrate deeper into the why should how can keep human these desires in check for the benefit of all, or why is there an innate tendency of humans to monopolize or to hoard things or to have those exploitative, how can, so the morality factor, the ethical factor is not entirely discussed in that overt sense. The prognosis is mainly economic, and how in the general scheme of things the exploitative groups may manipulate or monopolize resources, people, in an exploitative way. That's the panica given to it in that sense. But the factors, moral and the other factors, they are not given. The individual choice of humans to follow a certain path in that sense. So if we take Ibn Khaldun's dialectics, or if you take the dialectics of Hegel and Marx, so if you say modern dialectics consists in the continuous enlargement of subject, Ibn Khaldun's dialectics consists in eternal renewal. And the way I do not, it doesn't talk of eternal recurrence in that sense. So you can say this is the way historians. So if we want to also add, if we want to just, for example, one important thing about this thing is that which Iqbal has seen in relation to Spengler is, for example, Spengler's book about his decline of West where he talks of, for example, in that book, here I have taken a sentence from his book. Each culture has its own new possibilities of self-expression, which arise, which ripen, which decay, and never return. In that sense, so it's not eternal renewal. It's like a cycle comes, the cycle never repeats, in that sense. So Iqbal is trying to critique this idea in a specific Islamic context, in the context of the way in the previous chapters we discussed that the coming of Quranic way of looking at things was a fundamental shift in the speculative Greek way of looking at things, emphasis on rational only, in that sense. So, for example, what Iqbal's critique of Spengler is, Spengler's view of the spirit of modern culture is, in my opinion, perfectly correct. I have, however, tried to show in these lectures that the anti-classical spirit of modern world has really arisen out of the revolt of Islam against Greek thought. It's obvious that such a view cannot be acceptable to Spengler, for it is possible to show that the anti-classical spirit of modern culture is due to inspiration which is received from culture immediately preceding it. The whole argument of Spengler regarding the complete mutual independence of cultural growth would collapse. I am afraid Spengler's anxiety to establish this thesis has completely perverted his vision of Islam as a cultural movement. So this comes under this thing, the underreporting of the way the late Muslim they have. So it's the theme is that they rate the underreportage of how Renaissance is basically seen. It's not a fundamental shift. It's basically a continuation of a certain tradition, the Quranic tradition, the 10th century, the way the empirical tradition, which was inspired by Quran, or you can say the developments have been there. So if this Iqbal is not is trying to say this interpretation of history is not, it's hiding something in that sense, whether it's deliberate or whether it's also the way the biases of historians of reporting or interpreting the facts of history. So maybe Ibn Khaldun's lens can further illuminate on this aspect of things, in that sense. Now I'm going to add some of the maybe modern or postmodern constructs of how we can see historical facts or histories in that sense. For example, rethinking history. So history is first and foremost a literary narrative about past, a literary composition of data into a narrative where the historian creates meaning for the past. So now what are the historical facts? What is bias? And what does it mean to say that historians ought to detect it and root it out? Is history, scientific history possible, or history is essentially an art? So for some subject of history can be read, interpreted differently by geographers, by sociologists, by historians, by economists. So this is important. So what we talk is not past, but our understanding of past. So what we talk is not past, but our understanding of past. So, but does objective past exist? So, is fitting together of past history? There are very problematic areas, which not be epistemology, methodology, or ideology. Also, those come into considerations. So, materialistic interpretation of history, which is maybe inspired by Marxist way of looking at things, we give the particular course of history is described by particular economic causes, in that sense. Even though Ibn Khaldun also talks of economic and other causes in determining the forces of history, but he is primarily, his main important point is that of asbiyah as a determining factors, in that sense. So what's the status of truth in the discourses of history? So is there such a thing as objective history, or history is just interpretation? So how can we define bias or empathy, or in the very way how we can characterize history as a science or history as an art? So here, there is a very important point, which, for example, physicists and engineers get with the work, and their maybe method is hypothetical deduct reasonings, and grounds for their sources remain enigmatic. For example, for physicists, if we just ask them, why should, or engineers, why should be the external world in the naive obvious sense should concur with the regularity postulates, with the mathematical and rule-based bound expectations of investigative natural rationalism? No one knows. So, in one of the previous lectures, I also discussed the metaphysics of the law itself. How so? Why should there be law in that sense? That belief in that law. The human also says that the law order should be out there. Our impending need to find order in the universe, or why should the external world in the naive obvious sense should concur to the regularity postulates with the mathematical and rule-bound expectations of investigative rationalism? No one knows in that sense. Or no one doesn't know in that sense that expectation. We have to, why should we not question it in the first, or totally have a belief in it? So now, so here, maybe, so this is the way I have tried to just see today's lecture. Maybe I'll just quote Ibn Khaldun to end this lecture. So Ibn Khaldun did not turn to history to predict it in the precise sense, future sense, so that he could join the predetermined course of history. So there is not a pre-eternal determination, as if in that determinist sense. So history, even when certain created as and explained in the light of new science of culture, may help the wise man to make a better choice, but it does not and cannot choose for them. So you can say whatever the criteria Ibn Khaldun has given, or whatever the way the internal and the external causes, how the reports are constructed, or the interpretation of those reports in that sense, they may better help us to appreciate the ways history operates in some sense, the semblance in that sense. But for a particular event, it's not necessarily it's going to repeat. You have to be wise enough to apply those rules in wide circumstances to make a sense of the history. And not only you cannot these events cannot be devoid of the moral and other causes in that sense, apart from the way things operate in a given society in that sense. Hope you might have liked today's lecture in some sense, and trying to maybe have a tapestry of different viewpoints. Thanks for listening.